The palace was quiet, but the air trembled with unspoken tension. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, yet every echo, every measured step of a boot, every whisper behind a folding screen, felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The queen consort had spoken, a command, swift and absolute, cut through centuries of tradition, the immediate dismissal of a senior royal guard. In the gilded halls, eyes darted, jaws tightened, and silence became a presence of its own. Even the king hesitated, caught between loyalty to the crown and the protocols that had governed this palace for generations. Outside, servants paused mid-task, sensing the gravity of what had just unfolded, while hidden cameras captured fleeting expressions, shock, disbelief, quiet calculation. The guard, known for unwavering discipline, remained outwardly calm, yet beneath that stoic exterior, a storm of duty, honor, and conscience raged. Every gesture, every heartbeat, seemed magnified against the weight of royal authority. And somewhere in the shadowed corners of the palace, a silent witness waited. A hidden camera that might hold the truth capable of unraveling the queen's assumptions. The stage was set. Loyalties would be tested. Protocol would collide with personal authority. And in that fragile tension, a single question lingered. Who truly served the crown? And who serves only their own command? The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that command still hung in the air. Buckingham Palace, usually a monument to order and ceremony, had shifted in an instant. The queen consort's voice, crisp and unyielding, had cut through the gilded halls with a decree few had expected. The immediate dismissal of a senior royal guard. Whispers fluttered like restless shadows along the corridors. Some were quick, some hesitant, but all carried the same undercurrent of disbelief. Polished boots clicked against marble floors, each step amplified by tension. Servants paused mid-motion, their hands frozen over silver trays and folded linens. Even the king hesitated, a subtle furrow crossing his brow, as if measuring centuries of protocol against the certainty of a single voice. Cameras, stationed for ceremonial recording, captured fleeting reactions, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of doubt, eyes that momentarily betrayed the weight of the unspoken question. Was his command justified? The senior guard stood rigid, a figure carved from years of discipline and unwavering service. His eyes were steady, his hands controlled, yet the tension coiled within him, silent but alive. Every gesture in the room carried meaning. Every glance measured, as if the palace itself had become a living courtroom. Immediately, the queen consort repeated, her voice a polished instrument of authority. The word reverberated across the hall, demanding action without discussion. Loyalty and duty collided in the space between the command and its recipient. Whispers grew quieter, stifled by the weight of obedience. Protocol, once inviolable, now seemed fragile. The king remained seated, a quiet observer of the unfolding moral storm. His gaze flicked from the queen consort to guard, tracing a subtle tension that stretched beyond the room. In those moments, centuries of ceremonial expectation pressed against personal authority. The palace, steeped in history, seemed to hold its breath. Shadows deepened in the corridors. Hidden cameras, positioned for oversight, captured what eyes alone could miss. A fleeting gesture, a misalignment of protocol, an anomaly that contradicted the queen's assumption. The evidence was quiet, almost invisible, yet it promised a truth capable of unsettling the balance of power. Voices, hushed but urgent, began to ripple through the hall. "Your Majesty!" The guard acted within protocol. One aide whispered, careful and precise. The queen consort's eyes sharpened, unyielding, but the subtle shift of doubt had already begun. Every officer, every servant, felt the tension tighten like a rope around the palace itself. The guard's mind raced beneath the calm surface. Decades of ceremonial discipline, of silent vigilance, of service passed through his memory. Each duty performed with exactness, each command followed without question, had led to this moment, a confrontation between personal authority and institutional law. Loyalty was no longer simple. Obedience demanded a choice, and every heartbeat carried the weight of centuries. Portraits of past monarchs lined the walls, their painted eyes witnessing the unfolding drama. Marble floors, polished and cold, reflected the flicker of hesitation across the room. The palace, a repository of history and ritual, seemed to lean in, listening, waiting, its silence thick with consequence. The emotional tension tightened. The Queen Consort authority pressed down, absolute and commanding. The guard's loyalty to protocol pulled him in the opposite direction. The king, impartial yet burdened, measured the silence, aware that every second amplified stakes. In that quiet, invisible threads of duty, honor, and conscience intertwined, creating a latticework of moral tension. And then, a revelation. The hidden camera had captured more than simple protocol. The grainy footage hinted at truths unseen, details that could challenge the Queen's command, subtle gestures, fleeting movements, evidence that could exonerate the guard or condemn the order. The palace seemed to contract around the secret, the weight of potential truth pressing into every polished corner. The Queen Consort withdrew slightly, the certainty of command meeting the invisible edge of doubt. Hushed calculations passed through the minds of aides, officers, and guards alike. Silence was no longer empty. It was charged, a living force, carrying the suspense of what might unfold next. Every breath, every step, every glance held significance. In the shadowed corridor, the camera lingered on tapes, logs, and archival devices, promising evidence. The halls, steeped in history, echoed with anticipation. The unseen witness, the camera, waited to speak. And as the palace held its collective breath, the question crystallized. Loyalty to the throne or loyalty to the truth? The Queen's command had set events into motion. Obedience, authority, and morality now existed in delicate tension. And somewhere in that shadowed frame, the first hint of a challenge to power awaited discovery. A hidden camera in the palace shadows may hold the truth capable of disproving the Queen's assumptions. What it reveals next will test loyalty, duty, and the very fabric of the royal household. The palace had settled into a deceptive calm. Marble floors gleamed under filtered light, and chandeliers sparkled as if nothing had shifted. Yet beneath that serenity, the machinery of power quietly turned. Behind the gilded doors and ceremonial halls, a more intricate world existed, a lattice of hierarchy, protocol, and unspoken rules that few ever fully saw. The Queen's command had sent ripples outward, but now, behind the palace veil, those ripples began to collide with layers of institutional scrutiny. Senior aides moved with deliberate precision, retrieving security logs, consulting ceremonial manuals, and tracing archival footage with meticulous care. Each page turned, each entry scrutinized, carried weight. The palace operated not on whim alone, but on codified rituals, a century-spanning framework of order designed to prevent chaos. Yet the question now at the center of every discussion was simple, piercing. Had the guard truly breached protocol, or had authority been misapplied? The protagonist observer, a silent chronicler of palace life, notes the smallest gestures, an unspoken signal from a footman, a half-turn of an officer, a cautious glance exchanged between senior aides. These moments, fleeting to an untrained eye, revealed an undercurrent of doubt. The Queen's perspective, confident and absolute in her chamber, was incomplete. The palace itself, in its quiet bureaucracy, suggested layers of truth yet unseen. Logs revealed timing down to the second, boots striking marble in measured cadence, doors opening and closing with precise attention. Ceremonial sequences executed to perfection. Archival footage, grainy yet revealing, showed the guard performing each act with strict adherence to protocol. A ceremonial salute, a repositioning along a hallway, a pause at the exact line of duty. Each motion reflected training, ritual, and discipline. Officials debated quietly, the language formal but edged with tension. The sequence aligns exactly with procedural manuals. One aide noted, voice low but firm. Another countered, hesitant. Yet perception differs from protocol. The Queen's observation cannot be ignored. Words like perception and protocol hung in the air, heavy with implication. Loyalty and duty were no longer abstract. They were measurable, documentable, and potentially contradictory. The palace corridors became a theater of subtle motion. Cameras captured reflections in polished brass, shadows stretching across marble floors. Observers noted the tiniest deviations. Fingers brushing a railing, eyes briefly lowered, a breath held too long. These gestures, though imperceptible in public view, carried meaning for those trained to read them. Each microexpression was a thread, woven into a complex tapestry of intent, authority, and interpretation. As aides compared notes with ceremonial manuals, the moral stakes sharpened. Protocol was not merely rule following, it was the spine of the institution. Breaching it risked more than ceremony. It risked legitimacy. Yet authority, when exercised without complete knowledge, could bend that spine dangerously. The Queen's command, issued in the certainty of perception, now faced scrutiny from a hidden latticework of procedure and precedent. The narrative slows to capture the human element. The senior guard, still formally poised, is observed not just for action but for intent. His adherence to protocol is undeniable, yet the eyes that watch him search for deviation. In this quiet observation, loyalty is quantified, not assumed. Every gesture, every pause, becomes a piece of evidence. The palace, in this analytical moment, reveals itself as both witness and arbiter. A breakthrough arrives in the form of a subtle breach. An archival video shows a fleeting gesture, barely perceptible, a shift in posture, a hand slightly out of place, a momentary glance. It contradicts the Queen's narrative, suggesting that the full story is more complex than a single command might convey. Observers lean in, the hush of scrutiny palpable. The palace walls, normally mute, seem to hold their breath once again. Dialogue, soft and precise, punctuates the investigation. Look here. The alignment is correct, but notice the hand on the rail. And yet, she perceived hesitation. Perception is not protocol. Another voice interjects. The tension is moral as much as procedural. The Queen's authority, absolute in tone, now faces the cold, exacting eye of institutional fact. The emotional midpoint emerges as the observer reflects on layers of hierarchy. Palace staff, sworn to secrecy and loyalty, operate within rigid chains of command. A simple order carries repercussions across rooms, floors, and centuries of tradition. To challenge a command is to risk more than disfavor. It is to question the moral and ceremonial architecture itself. And yet, the evidence accumulates, building toward an inevitable confrontation between perception and truth. Camera cues drift through shadowed corridors and archives, lingering on security tapes, ceremonial logs, and handwritten notes from aides. The palace, a labyrinth of ritual and procedure, reveals the contrast between human authority and institutional memory. What was once unquestioned, obedience to the Queen, faces the impartial lens of fact, each frame and entry a small challenge to the narrative imposed from above. As the chapter approaches its climax, subtle patterns emerge. The guard's motions, minute and precise, consistently align with centuries of protocol. Yet the Queen's observations, colored by expectation and authority, remain at odds with evidence. In these contradictions, the palace itself becomes a moral arena. Every actor, guard, aide, monarch is caught between duty to the crown and duty to truth. The chapter closes on the smallest yet most potent detail, the fleeting gesture captured on archival video. A half-second of movement, almost imperceptible, may hold the key to reconciling or igniting the conflict between authority and procedure. The palace, cloaked in grandeur and shadow, waits for this revelation to unfold. Every whisper, every glance, every step holds significance. A small breach in protocol has been discovered, fleeting yet undeniable. It challenges the Queen's perception and sets the stage for confrontation. What the palace uncovers next will force every loyalist to choose between obedience and the unyielding truth. The corridors of Buckingham Palace were quiet, yet the tension lingered like smoke, slow-moving and pervasive. The hidden camera's revelation had rippled through the institution. A subtle gesture, a fleeting movement, captured in archival footage, now challenged the Queen Consort's assertion. What had seemed absolute, the authority of her command, was no longer unquestionable. Shadows stretched along the marble floors as aides and officers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken calculation. Every movement was measured, every pause deliberate, as if the palace itself waited for the first words of confrontation. The king, seated in the council chamber, observed the unfolding storm with the patience of a man who had learned that silence often carries more weight than speech. He watched the senior guard, whose stoicism now bordered on defiance, though tempered by loyalty and decorum. Every inch of his posture communicated discipline. every blink a reminder of decades devoted to ceremonial fidelity. Yet beneath the surface, a moral dilemma simmered: obedience to a single voice versus adherence to centuries of protocol. Voices rose softly in the private corridors. A senior aide whispered, "The footage shows alignment with procedural codes, Your Majesty." The Queen Consort's eyes, sharp and unwavering, reflected a moment of hesitation, almost imperceptible. "And yet," she replied, her voice measured, "it appears as though he faltered." The subtle clash of perception, in fact, filled the room like an invisible tension field. Guards shifted, eyes darted, and the unseen threads of loyalty stretched taut. In the hallways, silence alternated with murmurs of counsel. Observers noted every glance. The half-turn of an officer, the tightening of a hand around ceremonial gloves, the faint breath held too long before response. These small gestures became evidence, articulating what words could not. The palace had become a stage where authority and truth collided, and every participant was both actor and witness. The emotional midpoint arrived quietly within the king's chamber. He reviewed the footage once more, frame by frame. Each movement of the guard, precise and intentional, aligned perfectly with the ceremonial manuals. And yet, the queen's perception had differed, colored by expectation and the weight of her own authority. Loyalty, he realized, was no longer a singular concept. It existed on multiple planes: duty to the crown, adherence to tradition, fidelity to truth. And now, those planes were beginning to fracture. The guard, still outwardly composed, became a focal point of moral gravity. His loyalty was unquestionable, but the Queen's command created a tension that threatened to redefine it. Each gesture, salute, stance, pause was analyzed, debated, and questioned. Conversations in shadowed corridors reflected the same moral friction. Whispers passed between aides. He followed the protocol exactly, yet the Queen saw hesitation. Then perception must be reconciled with evidence. The questions hung, unresolved, thickening the air. The confrontation subtly escalated in private chambers. The Queen Consort, aware of the archival footage, faced a moral reckoning she had not anticipated. Authority alone could no longer dictate truth, and as aides and officers awaited her judgment, the tension in the palace intensified. Every action, every pause, every breath became loaded with significance. Even the walls, lined with centuries of portraits and ceremonial artifacts, seemed to bear witness, silent but accusatory. Dialogue, measured and precise, punctuated the rising tension. "Your Majesty, the guard has acted within all ceremonial guidelines." "And yet my command was not executed as I intended," she replied, her voice low but firm. The king intervened softly. "Authority must honor both perception and protocol. We cannot ignore either." The words hung between them, a fragile bridge over a widening chasm of loyalty and duty. As the chapter progressed, inner conflict intensified. Guards questioned their own actions, aides reconsidered counsel, and the Queen confronted the possibility that her perception had been flawed. Each decision carried moral weight, rippling outward, affecting every member of the royal household. Silence became as powerful as speech. The palace, normally a bastion of order, now vibrated with unresolved tension. The climax approached in the shadowed corridors where confrontation was inevitable. The Queen Consort, alone for a moment, reviewed the footage again. The fleeting gesture, subtle yet undeniable, revealed the guard's fidelity to protocol, contradicting her initial command. Authority, she realized, was not absolute when divorced from truth. The moral fracture became undeniable. Loyalty to a person versus loyalty to the institution itself. In those final moments, the palace held its collective breath. Guards stood at attention. Aides froze mid-step, and even the king's composed presence could not dissipate the moral weight pressing upon the walls. Every decision, every glance, every measured pause now mattered more than ever. The invisible threads of duty, authority, and conscience intertwined, creating a tension that could not be ignored. The evidence could no longer be denied. The Queen Consort faced a private reckoning, confronted with truths that challenged her authority. What she discovered next would determine not only the guard's fate, but the very balance of loyalty within the palace. The palace had shifted, The echoes of confrontation from the corridors lingered like shadows, stretching across marble floors and gilded halls. What had begun as a single command now unfolded into layers of consequence, silent but heavy. Whispered judgments moved through empty corridors, carried not by sound but by presence, an almost tangible awareness that truth, once glimpsed, could not be ignored. Hidden doors and forgotten archives revealed themselves to those who sought clarity. Ancient protocol manuals, brittle with age, were carefully opened, pages marked by decades of precedent. Handwritten annotations from generations of aides spoke of ceremonial integrity, of the weight carried by a guard's duty, and of authority exercised responsibly. The palace, normally a monument to stability, became a labyrinth of truth, where shadows revealed what daylight often concealed. The king reviewed the archival documents with deliberate care, his eyes tracing the careful handwriting of past advisors. Each margin note, each procedural outline, built a picture of the guard's unerring loyalty. It was a loyalty unshakable, tested by tradition, ritual, and centuries of ceremony. The realization settled slowly. The queen's command, though decisive, could have undermined centuries of institutional integrity. Authority had collided with a silent, enduring law of protocol. Meanwhile, the queen consort moved through the dimly lit corridors, the weight of her decision pressing on her with unexpected force. Her footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate, in private chambers. She reflected, alone with the consequences of her command. The archival footage, once just a silent observer, now held the power to rewrite her assumptions. The moral weight pressed heavily, forcing a reckoning she had not anticipated. Conversations were whispered in shadows. Aides and senior guards debated the footage, their voices cautious yet urgent. The guard acted exactly as prescribed. One noted, authority may have misperceived. Another countered. The palace absorbed each word, each exchange, each tension breath. Even the walls seemed to hum with the gravity of disclosure. History, it seemed, had been a silent witness all along. The emotional intensity rose as hidden details were uncovered. Protocols long forgotten, sealed documents tucked behind ceremonial ledgers, and marginal notes revealing centuries of practice, all converged to illuminate the guard's unwavering fidelity. Each revelation reinforced a simple truth. The queen's command, though authoritative, had overlooked the invisible architecture of palace law. The gap between perception and fact became undeniable, stretching across the chambers, corridors, and shadows. Private chambers became arenas of introspection. The queen consort, facing irrefutable evidence, confronted a moral fracture she could no longer ignore. The tension between personal authority and institutional loyalty crystallized. Every choice, every reflection, every sigh carried the weight of the monarchy itself. Even in solitude, the palace remained a silent witness, pressing its history upon those who served within its walls. The climax approached as the king prepared to act. Documents were reviewed, evidence confirmed, and ceremonial advisors stood ready. The palace, steeped in grandeur and shadow, now became the stage for truth to assert itself. The queen consort's authority, while still commanding, was tempered by the immovable reality of protocol. The moral reckoning was clear. Obedience to tradition and the guard's steadfast duty could not be compromised. In the quiet corridors, shadows lengthened and whispers slowed. Guards moved with renewed precision. Aides adjusted posture, and the king's presence radiated calm authority. The palace exhaled, though its release was measured, weighted by the enormity of revelation. The tension did not vanish. It transformed into a careful balance, a recognition of the enduring power of truth, protocol, and loyalty. A decisive action would soon follow. The king must publicly acknowledge the truth, confronting the consequences of the queen's command and restoring the delicate balance of loyalty and authority. What came next would determine the palace's equilibrium, and the lessons learned in shadows would echo in every hall. The palace breathed differently now. The tension that had gripped its gilded halls, its shadowed corridors, and its silent observers began to ease, replaced by a measured rhythm of restored order. Buckingham Palace, long a symbol of unwavering tradition, regained the poise that authority and duty demand. Yet beneath the calm surface, every participant, guards, aides, the monarchs themselves, carried the weight of what had transpired. Lessons have been learned in whispers and shadows, and in the careful observation of both protocol and conscience. The king prepared to address the matter publicly. His presence, composed and deliberate, radiated the authority of a man entrusted with centuries of ceremonial continuity. Standing in the grand hall, the golden light of morning filtering through expansive windows, he acknowledged the events with measured solemnity. His voice, firm yet respectful, conveyed the gravity of the situation. Loyalty to the throne and fidelity to protocol were not opposing forces, but complementary pillars of governance. The integrity of our traditions relies on both respect for authority and adherence to established procedure, he declared. We honor those who serve with unwavering commitment to duty. The actions of our senior guard exemplify this balance, reflecting discipline, judgment, and loyalty. Each word carried resonance, reaching every corner of the hall, touching the hearts of all present. The statement reaffirmed the guard's honor, restoring dignity to a position momentarily overshadowed by misperception. The queen consort, standing nearby yet slightly apart, absorbed the acknowledgement. The public validation, though subtly shifting her personal pride, reinforced a broader principle. Authority must harmonize with truth. Her posture, previously tense with the weight of command, softened with recognition. In that silent concession, the palace witnessed a reconciliation not of personalities, but of principles. The balance of power, carefully maintained for centuries, had been restored. The senior guard, now formally reaffirmed, stood at attention, his composure unbroken. Years of disciplined service, once questioned, now received the acknowledgment it had long earned. The hall, with its marble floors, gilded ceilings, and historic portraits, seemed gnawed in silent approval. Even the smallest gestures, a corrected salute, the subtle straightening of a uniform, reflected the restored equilibrium of order and respect. Elsewhere, aides and officers resumed their duties with renewed clarity. Protocol, once challenged by perception, now aligned with reaffirmed authority. The palace functioned as a living organism, each part moving in concert with the others. Conversations, though measured, carried relief, a recognition that truth and loyalty had prevailed. Shadows receded from corridors, replaced by the steady rhythm of disciplined steps and purposeful motion. The emotional weight of restoration unfolded subtly. The palace's hierarchy, previously tested by the tension between personal authority and institutional protocol, now regained its equilibrium. Decisions that had hung in the balance for days were resolved not by conflict, but by acknowledgement of facts. Loyalty was reaffirmed, authority tempered, and truth honored. The moral arc of the palace, though strained, had reached its rightful conclusion. Ceremonial rituals resumed with exacting precision. The king's acknowledgement, though dignified and restrained, reverberated to the palace like a heartbeat. Every gesture of the guard, every measured movement of aides, every attentive posture of ceremonial staff, reflected an institution returned to harmony. The palace, as it always had, maintained both discipline and dignity, proving that even in moments of potential fracture, balance could be restored. Calm reflections settled over Buckingham Palace. The Queen and the Guard, the King and his aides, each silently considered the weight of duty, the subtlety of authority, and the lessons learned. Yet questions lingered. How will this restored balance shape future commands, future loyalties, and the silent rhythms of palace life that continue unseen? The palace was quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight filtering through tall, arched windows. Buckingham Palace, a fortress of history and ceremony, seemed to exhale. Marble floors gleamed in gentle reflection, gilded portraits caught the light, and the echo of past disputes lingered only as memory. The tension of days past had settled into silence, a contemplative hush that invited reflection. In the throne room, the king stood alone, surveying the chamber. His gaze drifted over the golden insignia, the carefully maintained tapestries, the centuries-old relics of crown and duty. Each artifact bore witness to the weight of authority, the demands of service, and the subtle morality embedded within ritual. He considered the events that had unfolded, the Queen's command, the guard's unwavering fidelity, the hidden truths revealed in shadow corridors. Everything pointed to a single lesson. Loyalty and duty are inseparable, yet often tested in ways no decree can anticipate. The Queen Consort entered quietly, her presence dignified but tempered by reflection. She moved deliberately, acknowledging the weight of her prior command and the revelation it had set in motion. For the first time, perhaps, she felt the quiet power of restraint, the understanding that authority gains its strength not from immediacy, but from alignment with truth and tradition. Together, though not in words, they shared the recognition that monarchy is sustained by careful judgment as much as ceremonial power. The guard, no longer under scrutiny, observed from a respectful distance. His service, precise and unwavering, had endured both command and doubt. He understood, as did those around him, that loyalty is tested in silence as much as in action. The palace, with its endless corridors and gilded chambers, had witnessed this test and upheld the integrity of its principles. Every gesture, every salute, every motion of obedience carried deeper meaning now, framed by reflection and renewed understanding. As the king slowly paced the throne room, his thoughts turned to the broader lessons of authority. Orders, no matter how well-intentioned, carry consequences beyond immediate perception. Protocol is more than formality. It is the spine of continuity, the measure against which both actions and intentions are judged. And truth, quiet and persistent, reveals itself not in confrontation, but in observation, in patience, in the willingness to weigh both fact and loyalty equally. The Queen Consort lingered before a portrait of a past monarch, the lines of the painting steeped in history, a reminder that every decision echoes across generations. She reflected on pride, authority, and the humility required to govern with wisdom. The palace, silent and majestic, seemed to absorb her contemplation, lending weight to the stillness. Every shadow, every ray of light, every artifact became a mirror for moral thought, a reflection of duty tempered by conscience. The guard adjusted his stance, eyes forward, posture impeccable. His role, once threatened by misperception, now aligned seamlessly with the principles that govern the palace. In his discipline, the silent power of loyalty and restraint became apparent. Service, it seemed, was not merely the execution of orders, but the embodiment of values that outlast commands, disputes, and fleeting authority. The chamber remained hushed, yet the moral resonance of recent events filled the space. Decisions had been weighed, authority had been reconciled with truth, and the palace itself had reaffirmed the delicate balance between loyalty, duty, and discernment. Reflection, slow and deliberate, became the final act of the day. In this silence, the palace conveyed the most enduring lesson. That power without conscience is empty, and obedience without truth is fragile. As sunlight faded and shadows deepened, the palace settled into quiet contemplation. History, duty, and loyalty remained intertwined, and the echoes of today's lessons lingered. The question, subtle and enduring, hung in the air. What would one do if duty and loyalty demanded opposing paths? The palace offered no answer, only the enduring weight of reflection.